So, welcome everyone to the fifth seminar in our online lecture series on resource struggles in international law under occupation, convened by myself, Julia Dem, and my colleagues Sahiba Muckle and Caitlin Murphy. Before introducing our speaker, we want to acknowledge that we're joining the seminar from occupied land and that struggles for land justice, for water justice, and resource justice continue across this continent. We want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional owners of the land on which we are, that this land was stolen and that sovereignty was never ceded. We pay our respects to their elders past and present.
This online lecture series seeks to foster interdisciplinary and historically inflected discussions about how international law both shapes and is shaped by struggles over natural resources. This semester, we're focusing on resource struggles in the context of occupation around the world. We're collectively exploring how struggles over resource plunder and exploitation shape the dynamics of occupation, and how peoples under occupation are contesting extraction and asserting ownership and sovereignty over resources as part of broader resistance movements. So we've got speakers examining resource struggles under occupation in Greenland, West Papua, Palestine, Kashmir, Bougainville, and Western Sahara, to consider the different forms of political contestation that they produce and how resource struggles might be mobilized to enliven political possibilities for self-determination and decolonization.
We are delighted to have such a wonderful line of speakers, as well as Professor Kristian Lasslett, who we will hear from today. We have lectures from Dr. Andy Irwin on Western Sahara and Dr. Hadil Abu Hussein on Palestine. Details of these other lectures are in the chat. Additionally, Dr. Anna Saunders and Julia will be convening a reading group on the theme of making and unmaking natural resources. And if you are interested, more details are also in the chat.
I'm delighted now to introduce our speaker for today. Kristian Lasslett is Professor of Criminology in the School of Applied Social and Policy Sciences at Ulster University. His research focuses on elite networks, corruption, and resources using ethnographic and investigative methods. He examines how malign activity is enacted and concealed through network structure, corporate vehicles, and jurisdictional arbitrage. His work has regional depth in Central Asia and Pacific, alongside analysis of global offshore centres. He is a joint editor-in-chief of State Crime and producer of the documentaries Orpha and the Colonial Syndrome. Thank you so much for speaking to us today, and over to you now, Chris.
Yeah, no worries, my pleasure. And so to kick off, thought it would be handy. I will share my screen in a moment because I do have a few slides that have some of the interesting data that comes from this work. But firstly, I thought it might be useful to provide an overview of the Bougainville conflict, just for those who aren't as familiar with some of the kind of fault lines that were at its center. So obviously it was a war that took place in Bougainville, which is the easternmost province of Papua New Guinea, and obviously now it's following a referendum there. It's slated to become an independent state in the foreseeable future, it was obviously the conflict ran from 1988 to 1997, and it was precipitated by significant what's the right word? Significant contention over the Panguna copper and gold mine that was operated by Rio Tinto through its subsidiary known as Bougainville Copper Limited. So I'll often just say BCL, as it's known. And that tension, that contention, unraveled, which will go through into the war. And the war pitched the Bougainville Revolutionary Army, who were the rebels, against the Papua New Guinea Defence Force, the Australian Defence Force, and a kind of surrogate logistic apparatus provided by Rio Tinto through BCL. And there were also what we call paramilitaries on Bougainville that were also loyal to the state, or at least fighting along the state. So those were the fault lines of the conflict. And during its decade-long hostility, approximately 20,000 people were killed, which was a significant percentage of the population. And I originally was going to put up some quotes that outline some of the atrocities that took place during the conflict, but actually I took them down because they're so horrible, and I didn't I felt I almost felt like I was doing it for shock value than to and I didn't. But suffice to say, the military campaign that was waged by PNGDF, the Papua New Guinea Defence Force, and the Australian Defence Force was with Bougainville Copper Limited's assistance was involved some pretty large scale war crimes that we'll talk a bit about a bit later, and the rebels as well, were certainly also involved in serious human rights abuses, but the wholesale abuse or the large scale abuse was perpetrated by the state parties, who obviously had the resources. So I might, on that note now, just share my slides. I'll just try and pick up from the. There we go. There will be some quote. There we go. Hopefully you can see that now, and you'll see now there the a little map of Bougainville, and you can see just down the centre the Crown Prince Range, where there's Panguna. That's where the mine was. And as I said, the I talked about the conflict having begun in 1988. That was a time, a framing that I used when I wrote my book. And it's not a framing that my friends on Bougainville agree with. And I certainly have revised that framing because they advised me that the conflict began in 1886. And I thought that was, and they had compelling justifications for arguing that. And that date obviously denotes the period when Germany and Britain divided up what is now Papua New Guinea into German New Guinea, British Papua, British New Guinea. And as a result of that carve up, Bougainville fell initially under the control of Germany as the imperial power, and then during World War One, Bougainville fell under the control of Australia. So it's when Australia took over in 1914, and from then on was the colonial administrator of Bougainville. Though often if you use the word colonial, it can generate it. So it's in the past generated quite a bit of controversy, though it's fairly obviously was a colonial power there. And during this first sort of German-Australian phase up until the Second World War, it was a very sort of skeletal colonial effort. There was settler plantations and indentured labour used on those settler plantations, but there really wasn't much of a governance structure that was operationalized on Bougainville. It was primarily just a resource extraction operation for the plantations and some mining as well, some smaller scale at this stage, obviously. And primarily it was the missionaries coming in and setting up church administrations, and then a very slight smattering of colonial police officers and administrators and officials. And so this first phase, I guess, was marked by people getting experience with trading with the Europeans and with the changing of their spiritual activities. But overall, it was fairly modest at this stage, and it was only in the immediate post-war period where Australia, as the colonial power for what is now Papua New Guinea, began to see the writing on the wall, as obviously Britain's sun was setting rapidly, and Australia was aware that its sun would set in Papua New Guinea, and as a lot of officials from that period told me, it wasn't like this was a colonial acquisition that was far away. It was on Australia's doorstep, so there was a real importance on ensuring that there was, a quote unquote stable transitional arrangement put in place, because they didn't want, again, a basket case in their own region, which Australian taxpayers would have to prop up for a long period. So in this immediate post-war period, there was a lot more emphasis on smallholder agriculture, especially in places like Bougainville, where they started to grow cocoa and things like that. And they began to rapidly mobilize communities to engage in smallholder agriculture so they could begin to generate a cash-based economy. Um, and um, and also at the same time, there was a beginning of a much more significant governance structure put in place, modelled obviously on a Westminster style, which is interesting in itself because, again, there was no consideration to adapting or trying to model a kind of form of governance that might be suitable to local interests. It was just, let's go and take a very top-heavy, expensive structure, plonk it down on Papua New Guinea, and then say, oh, geez, this is very expensive. This place is going to really need to monetize its resources rapidly. And so that's when Bougainville became extremely strategically significant, because it had a large copper and gold ore body going down the Crown Prince Range. And that became kind of a godsend for the Australian administration, who saw no real way in which Papua New Guinea could become economically self-reliant. And this mine, or this potential mine, became the bolt from the blue that was going to allow Australia to kind of walk away and allow and sort of to not be on the hook for funding an independent Papua New Guinea. And so and they also had Rio Tinto, which at that stage was Conzinc Rio Tinto of Australia, come in and agree to help develop the mine. And that was quite a significant undertaking, with a lot of because they had to essentially build everything from scratch, from port facilities to the energy generation, etc. And it was bitterly opposed by people on Bougainville, and particularly people in the affected areas. I mean, it was pretty much unanimous opposition. And on that screen, you can see one of the sort of famous Rorovana women who were blockading mine development work and were escorted fairly roughly by the riot squads. But obviously, a significant part of Bougainville, not all of it, is matrilineal. So there was a especially significant role for women in the resistance, as the people who had the custodial duty to preserve the land for future generations. And so they played a significant role and continue to play a significant role today. So then, nonetheless, despite the resistance, the mine went ahead, and it generated. I mean, the interesting thing was when you go back even into the archives, you can see all the concerns that were being raised at local hearings by communities who said, we're worried about how this is going to create environmental destruction. It's going to create inequalities. It's going to create significant social tensions. It's going to lead. We're going to see a lot of the value from this mine taken away, and it's going to make people rich abroad, and we're going to be left impoverished. All that was raised in the 1960s and dismissed out of not straight out of hand. Often the Kiaps were more, the Australian officers on the ground were more were somewhat more sympathetic, but the policymakers in Canberra certainly dismissed it out of hand. And ironically, they were absolutely razor sharp in in their analysis and in predicting what was going to happen. And the Australian view that it was going to bring about something much more positive proved to be utopian in its nature. And sure enough, in the 1980s, the mine was doing exactly what people had been anticipating and concerned about. The environmental destruction, the divisions within communities, the impact on health, and also the large influx of people coming into work, which caused a whole range of other social issues that were difficult. And this led to a growing political consciousness, particularly amongst the youth generation, who were really coming to maturity as these really deleterious impacts were being felt. And they became the kind of bulwark of this new resistance movement that emerged. So we had the first obviously in the 1960s, and the second resistance movement on Bougainville really emerged in 1987, where for a long time landowner interests around the mine had been represented by a body called the Panguna Landowners Association, and that association in 1987 had an election, and a lot of the older male elected office holders who had been more or less pretty sympathetic to BCL and had become fairly prosperous business people were voted out, and a new, again, quote, air quote, radical youth leadership were voted in, and you can see there with the microphone there, Perpetua Serrero, who was the chairperson of the organization, and then on to her right, you can see Francis Ona on the who ended up becoming the leader of the Bougainville Revolutionary Army. And after they were elected, they issued a request for compensation to Bougainville Copper Limited, or BCL, for 10 billion kina. And if you think that that may have been a lot less if you convert into US dollars, no. Back then, that was about US $10 billion that they demanded for the harm that had been occurred on their island. And they then also gave them a couple of years to leave. So it wasn't pay us compensation and you can continue operating here. It was you'll have time for a structured period to leave, and you're going to pay us compensation. And at this stage, you can see there the quote from one of the BCL general managers who I interviewed, who at this stage they felt dismayed. They said the old leaders had, and this was the old leaders who got voted out, had greater commercial acumen than the new landowner group. They were largely composed of people involved in business with sound financial minds. And there seemed to be a general feeling of embarrassment and of dismay at the April claims of the new Panguna Landowners Association. It was still the old Panguna Landowners Association, a new officials. And I think that was and you'll see in a quote I'll show you in just a moment, the feeling amongst the mining company. And I think it's probably important to say the mining company at this stage, this were people who've been on the island. Often they lived there for 10, 15, 20 years. And they were most of the people I interviewed loved Bougainville. You went to their houses and it was covered in memorabilia. They had a huge amount of affection for Bougainville and its people and culture. And it wasn't, so I think it's important to say this was not like a stereotypical racist, mining company. They were people who really had developed a great, degree of love and community on Bougainville. And that's what makes what happened subsequently, somewhat more perplexing, but but there are reasons for it. But what they couldn't understand was that that there could be people who just opposed the mine and everything it was doing to their community, and they assumed at this stage that these new leaders were simply after more money. And more money probably for their own pockets. So they assumed they applied a particular logic that they could appreciate to landowner leaders, and those landowner leaders were not motivated by the same logic, and they continued um, to escalate actions in order to close the mine, and that culminated quite significantly. It began with sit-ins and blockades of the mine, and then some of the PLA members broke into the storage facilities, got dynamite, and the mine was dependent on Arawa power station and power pylons that would take the power up to the processing facilities, and all they had to do was blow a few of them up, and they could shut the mine down. And that's what they did. And in November of 1988, and this obviously caused a huge amount of concern within BCL. Their view was that they weren't opposed to modifications in the governance arrangements around the mine, but they felt that it needed to be done in an orderly manner according to stipulated agreements that had been set up in the 1960s. So there was a Bougainville Copper Agreement that was made into legislation, and it provides opportunities. I think it was every 7 or 8 years that there could be a review process where the existing compensation and royalties could be revised. And BCL felt that that would be the appropriate forum in which to hear these grievances and to make decisions. They didn't want to do this outside of the BCA, and I think it also links to the way in which mining capital, becomes incorporated, and that is that mining capital has a large fixed element, where especially with a mine like BCL, yeah, they've invested a lot of the capital is absorbed in mammoth facilities that's used to extract and refine the ore, and you're talking billions of dollars in infrastructure, and then the circulating element of capital is fairly modest compared to what's been fixed. And that means for mining executives, and this is where even ones who were fairly progressive by the period, they have to think in terms of 20 to 30 years. And at the moment, they're going, well, these people are trying to change agreements on a day-to-day basis. And you can see here a quote from one of their senior executives. Said, "We didn't like to be pushed into things the Melanesian way, because the Melanesian way is a little bit, you put pressure on someone and the pressure results in a reward. And then there is an attitude, I wish I'd asked for more. How do I get more? You then reapply pressure, perhaps a little bit harder next time, and then you get a bigger reward. And eventually you're asking, how can I stop this? They are bleeding the company dry." And so at this stage, BCL and CRA took the view that the government needed to go in there and take a hardline approach by sending in the police mobile squads, which were a paramilitary force. So they weren't your normal police. They went in there. They were a semi-army. And in this next slide, you can see the manner in which they went about this. So this is from a meeting. This is from a memorandum that the chairman of Conzinc Rio Tinto sent to his directors, saying that on Friday the 25th November, Bob Cornelius, who's the managing director of BCL, went to Port Moresby to press the government to do something about the law and order situation, and especially about the theft of explosives. He met a hostile reaction from the Ministers for Minerals and Energy and Provincial Affairs and the North Solomons Premier, who blamed BCL for all the trouble. And of course, that's true. The PNG political elite were going, well, you guys have made a lot of money and you haven't done much for the island, and they weren't ultra sympathetic with BCL. In response to this and to the arson on Saturday the 26th, I went to Port Moresby on Monday the 28th to express my concern to the Prime Minister Minister. I saw him with the Minister for Provincial Affairs, who continued his verbal attack on BCL. The PM's priority was to appease the landowners. I expressed the view that CRA would want to review its assessment of PNG as a place to invest. In all, it was an unsatisfactory meeting. Now, at this stage, if CRA had reviewed PNG as a place to invest, it would have bankrupted the country because they were so dependent on the receipts that PNG mines, that CRA mines were producing. So that was quite a significant threat for the chairman to level. Then initially the government did ignore the threat and sent in a peace delegation. But Paul Towian, the head of the RPNGC, the police, decided to engage in a surprise attack on the after the peace negotiations and tried to arrest all the landowner leaders. They fled into the bush. And then they formed the BRA. It wasn't initially known as the BRA, but it became known as the Bougainville Revolutionary Army, or BRA. And they began to engage in what would become a counter-insurgency, an insurgency. And then the Papua New Guinea had sent over the Papua New Guinea Defence Force and also mobile squads from the police. And they were there to try and take out this emerging rebellion on the island. And BCL became complicit because obviously, as you saw before, they were looking for this kind of hard line approach, and now they got it. But they had a military that wasn't prepared. I mean, Papua New Guinea was not ready for a large-scale counterinsurgency operation, and so they needed Bougainville Copper to come to the party, so to speak. Here you can see the level of support that Bougainville Copper provided to the Papua New Guinea military. So this is one quote from a BCL general manager whose job it was to liaise with the military. And he gives you a sense of the level of support the company provided. The reality was we can't do our things because we haven't got vehicles, so we give them vehicles. We haven't got radios, so we can't communicate, so we give them two-way radios. We can't support our men over here. We haven't got enough provisions, so we give them the mess. We'd feed them in the mess. We'd provide them with accommodation. We did everything they asked of us to make their life more comfortable and better able to manage through with transport, communications, provisions, whatever, fuel. We gave them everything because as far as we saw it, we were hoping that they were going to solve the situation so we could start operating again. So we supported them every way we could because obviously at this stage, whilst the rebellion was taking place, the mine was shut down, and PNG and BCL saw that a military campaign would allow the mine to reopen. And you can see that support he refers to there is set out on the table in intimate detail. So it was significant. And one thing to note is I was very careful when I interviewed them and said, were you surprised by the human rights abuses and atrocities that the military then committed with your support? And not one of the managers said they were surprised. They were acutely aware the PNGDF and the mobile squads had a reputation. And their statements to me were that, well, there weren't any other options. There were no good militaries to choose from. They chose the military they had, and they knew what they were getting, and they were hoping it was going to be over soon, and it wasn't going to turn into a prolonged conflict, which it did. And here you can just see little vignettes from the meeting minutes, wherein the level of Bougainville Copper's involvement, they were meeting with the military brass, with military commanders on the ground. They were talking to them about operations, planning operations together. And RJC, that's Bob Cornelius, the managing director, where he's even giving advice to the military that perhaps they should go after certain civilian leaders. And so that was just how integrated the company and the military had become. And then, of course, there was the Australian government, and what role did they play? And I'll be quick here because I'm conscious of time, and I'll just say that the Australian government, which given our Prime Minister's currently in the US, or was at least recently, That's relevant because at the time, Australia had gone to Washington, D.C. in the late 1980s under the Hawke-Keating government and had said Australia was prepared to play its part in upholding Pacific stability. So they were going to be America's deputy in the Pacific region. And as we know, Trump has said often the allies are not paying their way and holding their way. Australia was there saying, well, we are. We're going to do that in the Pacific region. And they were hoping that then America would give them full-throated support for their free trade in Asia. So they were setting up APEC and they're hoping if they offered the defense carrot, they would get American support for the free trade as a quid pro quo. And of course, that was probably a fairly serene offer to make because in 87, 88, there was no conflict in the Pacific region. And so Australia wasn't suddenly one landed and they had to do something about it. And of course, the Australian government denied publicly it was doing anything. And Gareth Evans, who was a foreign minister, said, Australia has only ever supported a peaceful resolution, has had no direct role in the conflict. Then I went round and interviewed the Australian High Commission officials, the Australian Defence Force officers, and they had a very different memory of what had happened. When the shit hit the fan in 1989, it was a fairly big part of one's life for a while there. The head of Australian Defence Force in PNG said, we were early on supporting a stronger PNGF role than they actually played. We were pushing them to get more troops over there. Ben Sabumi was the minister, and I used to see him all the time saying, get your people over there. And then here's a statement on the support, which kind of echoes BCL, but with the logistics support that we supplied to the PNGF during that time was very large and significant. Without our people, they couldn't have done what they did. We'd be training them at training camps. We'd be supplying them with weapons. We'd be supplying them with uniforms, everything. And then we say, these companies are now fit to be used. Let's send them now to Bougainville. We'd even fly them to Bougainville, for God's sake. So we would facilitate everything. I don't think it's stretching the point to say too much that anonymised and a few others, an ADF officer, and we were included in this, started to devise an operation to win Bougainville back, winning it back in a military sense when it was in total darkness. The case was totally hopeless. So that Australia was covertly on the ground, had ADF on Bougainville. They were co-planning the military operations and they were providing the military they were training the military and they were providing them with all the armaments that they needed. They also provide them with Iroquois helicopters, with naval vessels, and that would be critical. And I am going to jump over this because very quickly so we can conclude and questions can be asked. But the Papua New Guinea government, with Australian support, set up a full blockade around Bougainville, and nothing was allowed in. Not even humanitarian aid was permitted onto the island, and that was, as you can see there from the quotes there, that was supported by Australia. The government was, in spite of itself, on the right course, which was deny goodies. By goodies, they mean essential surgical equipment for women who are hemorrhaging during childbirth. And it's also alleged by PNG's foreign minister, who was then Michael Samare, that BCL gave full support to the blockade. And it had an extravagant toll on the population in terms of needless loss of life. Now, to wind up, obviously, the war would continue for many more years, and a lot of life would be lost as a result of what you just saw was sort of pump prime there. And the war ended in 1997, and that actually happened when Papua New Guinea contracted the British mercenaries, Sandline, and there was an uprising within the Papua New Guinea Defence Force over the extravagant sums that were being paid. They'd been dying on the island for much less. That brought the government of Sir Julius Chan to its knees, and that created the groundswell for peace. And a peace agreement was reached in 2001. That led to the referendum recently, where Bougainville voted overwhelmingly for independence. But I think just to conclude, I mean, what I think is really striking for me in all this is that um, if you read a lot of the literature, a lot has talked about the really important work that took place with peacemaking on Bougainville, and I wouldn't want to kind of at all diminish that. It was important, it was significant, and it was successful, but it was all very much about local communities who making peace with one another, because there was a lot of fracturing that I couldn't do justice to on the island. Um, but what struck me was the absence of number of parties from ever being held to having to participate in this, and that was the Papua New Guinea government and the PNGDF, the Australian government and the Australian Defence Force, and Bougainville Copper and Conzinc Rio Tinto, as it's now known. There's never been whilst at the same time there were truth and reconciliation at this time was a big thing around. It was being used a lot. No one ever thought about a truth process for Bougainville. And you don't set up a truth process where you know what the results are going to be. And Australia at the time was funding a lot of this, and I don't think there was any desire for truth to be told. And people on Bougainville have attempted to seek some remedy through legal action, but have been opposed every step of the way. They tried initially with alien tort statute action in the US, and that was kicked out on jurisdictional grounds, but not before the Australian government and the British governments put in amicus curiae briefs opposing the action, saying it would be very bad precedent for business if this were to go ahead in the US court. And obviously there's been a few attempts since then for litigation, but anyone knows with civil litigation, it's extremely difficult in these kinds of conditions to put something forward. So and now we're sitting at the precipice of independent Bougainville, but again, mining is back on the table, and there are talks of reopening the mine again. And there's a lot of Australian exploration companies and mining companies on the ground, and they're not just looking at Panguna, they're also looking at prospects on other parts of the island. So I think I'll leave it there, conscious of the time, and conscious that this is a topic I can easily talk about for long periods. Stop sharing.
Thank, thank you so much. That was just such an incredible overview of, I think, a history that really needs to be much more widely known in Australia. And I think there needs to be so much more awareness of this, because that is the first, element for that sort of accountability and that truth telling. It's so shocking to hear that there has been, none of that, and none of the accountability. And I'm particularly struck by precisely that point, that now that, independence for Bougainville is on the table, it seems to be accompanied by, the reopening of mining, and things, and like sort of, conceptually, like as an international lawyer, I wonder whether there's something in sort of the right to self-determination, that you have to be a particular type of self, that the state has to be constituted in a particular extractivist way to have that sort of right to self-determination. But also just wonder if you can speak a little bit more about the current contestation around mining, because I imagine that there's so much, like there's been such, generations of community resistance, and I imagine a lot of that community resistance to mining would still be ongoing, and some of the forms that that's taking, some of the activism that's happening on the ground, or some of the conversations that are happening on the ground, particularly about the sort of about mining. And just as a side, whether is mostly copper and gold, or whether there's also critical minerals, given they're so topical in the news at the moment, that are co-located, and just a bit more about the resources that are being extracted at the moment. Thanks.
Yeah, no.
And just say
That's
too,
right.
please, if anyone else has questions, please raise your hand or pop them in the chat.
Yeah, it's definitely, um, the yeah, mining is I mean it's an interest it's quite a complex. I mean it's complicated by the fact that um, it is now the ABG government, so the autonomous Bougainville government. It's under the lead. Oops, my light's just gone out. Apologies about that. So I'm in the dark. Hang on, I'll just turn on the light. The uh, and the government is led by a former Bougainville Revolutionary Army leader, and they're and that again, but even going back to the initial conflict days, the Bougainville Revolutionary Army wasn't unanimous in its view on mining. There were some people. Francis Ona was known as the unreasonable radical because, as some would say to me, he was unreasonable. He was like, no, no to mining. That was and there were others in the army who said, well, we'll need mining one day when we are successful in our objective. I think. And so I think that's the complexity at the moment, right? Is that uh, there are people who are now in charge of government who see mining as a way of financing an independent Bougainville, and that's very emotive for people. So it's not quite so easy to weigh it up because people desperate feel so much blood has been shed for this moment, and so it is a very difficult choice. And it's obviously there are people who are going to be immediately affected and those who aren't, and that also comes into play. Um, and then. And then, of course, um, there's a question of mining. I mean, I think in the work I've done and the work colleagues have done have found that there's still a strong, particularly in the Panguna and the impacted areas, still strong opposition, and it's always been underplayed. I mean, back when we were looking at this back in 2009, 2010, we were told it's unanimous support for mining and when we went and actually did research on the ground, we found that actually it was the opposite. And then and now I don't know what the exact current balance of opinion would be, but I could see it would be split a lot more than it probably would have been even 10 years ago when we're looking at it because of the emotiveness of independence. And then I think then there's the issue, but of um, the economic edifice through which mining is going to be spearheaded. And it is everything I've seen is called maximum opaqueness. It's these exploration companies with offshore structures, with whose ultimate beneficial owners are kept concealed. They go to the government and pitch structures for setting up mining that will again be similarly opaque. I think there's always has been evidence that the political leadership on Bougainville are as much as compromised as by corrupt relations. I'm not going to level an allegation at any particular individuals, obviously, but corruption has been a significant issue, and that goes back right to the very early days. I mean, I remember one thing that the women they for a documentary film I was involved in. Afia, the which is the original name for Bougainville, not the colonial name. And The women did this play, and it was about BCL coming to their communities, and they would come in there and offer to help them develop. To them, that was bribery because they would take people and get help men go into business who were not the landowners and would give them access to money. They said that was grease, that was bribery, and that was to compromise people's decision making. And I think that's true back then, and it's true now. There's a lot of this going on, and it's hidden. Sorry, yep.
Oh, no, thank you so much. That was such a fantastic, fascinating talk. I was just really struck and interested in the process of the research. It seemed like when you were able to talk to military or company officials, that the threat of accountability seemed to them not present enough that they felt the need to hide their involvement to you. Is that right? What was the kind of some
Yeah,
of those conversations like?
I think that's a really pertinent observation. That's exactly what happened was I went into this research somewhat naively in thinking that this is going to be very tough. It's going to be grueling. I'm probably no one's going to speak with me, and I'm going to have to hash. And this is back. This began originally as PhD research and I thought I don't even know how I'm going to have enough to have a viable PhD. It was a real anxiety, and then I suddenly I went and sent all these letters out. I got the white pages, found all and sent. I'd gone to Seattle, got all the documents that they got for the litigation, and it gave me a wonderful, huge cache of just documents for discovery. So I knew who all the people were who were involved. Then I sent them letters, and they all responded. They wanted to speak. And then I went down to Canberra, and people. Then I went up to Papua New Guinea, and met people like Sarabi Nabalu, and who was the Prime Minister and who was then a Foreign Minister at the time, and they're all happy. PNGDF all happy to speak, and then I would say, "Is it okay if I record?" Sure, record, informed consent, and then I thought, okay, and then people just began talking at length about things, and again, I was not. You're beginning as a researcher, and you're not subtle. You say, "Well, but hang on." You say, and I would ask them quite abrupt questions about, and they weren't. I mean, it was. I thought the one that was really most interesting was when I went to Canberra, and I thought, now everyone in Canberra is as slippery as hell. I'm not. There's nothing I'm not going to be able to find out anything here. And I just went and met these very senior, but now, they're just retired now, working in civil society or in, institutes and stuff, who've been in the area, and they were like, oh, we're not going to bullshit you here. We're going to tell you exactly what happened. We were there. It was covert. It was, we knew what was going on. We knew the atrocities that were taking place. We're like, we're not going to pretend we're naive. So it was, but yeah, but I think there was never a sense that these kinds of disclosures would lead to anything substantive. I mean, there wasn't even the concern of the loss of reputation, much less some kind of viable accountability mechanism. And I remember when I tried to begin to raise the alarm about this, I mean, I got support from the Australian Greens, who were the only ones who took it at all seriously. And I got, as I said, courtesy of my dad writing a plea to Philip Adams. I got onto ABC radio, but I did get another interview with the one of the Pacific shows. It was not with Papua New Guineans. It was Australian journalists, and I remember walking them through the same evidence that I had now, and they referred to the claim that BCL assisted the military. They said, well, they're allegations, and I had these quotes all there on paper. And I said, but that's not an allegation, that's a confession. And it was, so there's been a real reluctance, I mean, even amongst journalists, to see there's something here, we should be bringing this out. It was almost, and I said that parallels with today, where you had people come into Australia to talk about Gaza, and they're treated as an enemy of honesty and good journalism, people to be grilled. And I felt that back in a much smaller scale, but I definitely felt when I naively thought I would be walking into press rooms and greeted with open arms by interested public interest journalists, and when in actual fact I was mainly treated with kind of skepticism, with some very wonderful honorable exceptions. I don't want to, there's some really great journalists have always done, I'm thinking even, people like Phil and Ben Doherty, another one from The Guardian, and people like that who have always been really supportive. So it's not at all uniform, but it certainly feels overwhelming when you're doing it. Yeah.
think we've got time for about one more question if someone's got any other questions or observations or comments. There's a question in the chat saying, exceptional talk, thank you. I might have missed it, but is there any talk about reparations now?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a move, well, a kind of negotiation that's been done on a voluntary basis where Rio Tinto, working with leaders on Bougainville and with the Australian Human Rights Law Centre, I think is the correct name, and there've been a sort of voluntary process of environmental remediation, and that's been taking place, but and that would be looking at how kind of what Rio Tinto can do. They would argue probably, if you ask them, that well, we left the island very rapidly. We didn't have a chance to properly vacate the premises. Now we're happy to come back now and actually properly administer the closing of the mine and try and prevent some of the harms that unfortunately happened as a result of what occurred. Then there's also litigants who are exploring, and it's been in the newspaper that there've been a few. They're looking at a Papua New Guinea based action. And of course, that then creates tensions because there's concern amongst those who've been working for years on the voluntary remediation that Rio Tinto will just pull the plug and will walk away from voluntary remediation because they're too worried about the civil litigation. And obviously, for people involved in the civil litigation, they're like, well, how can you really, how does voluntary remediation do full justice? So there's tensions over what is the right path. But no, there's not been reparations of any sort paid. And, there's never been reparations even considered by the Australian government. I mean, that's the irony to it all. Australia's often talked about the largesse with which it's helped support the peace process on Bougainville, but never talked about its own debt it owes to the island for being a key belligerent. And what that would involve, and no, and obviously Papua New Guinea hasn't approached that issue of reparations either. So no, and the real consequence of that is that there's some really interesting work done by doctors, by psychologists have gone and just tried to get a sense of the lasting impacts of the war crimes and the trauma. And I know I think it was a Melbourne-based psychologist who went and published a paper on it a couple of years ago, and it was just incredible. I mean, and I'm based in Belfast, so I know just how visceral the long-term impacts of conflict are and the resources that are needed to deal with that. And Bougainville's had none of it. They've literally had no resources to deal with this. So reparations are kind of critical in allowing people to come. And people still haven't got buried their loved ones. I mean, there's movements there about finding the remains of their loved ones still, because that hasn't been done. So there's so much that's been left off the table there. It's a real tragedy.
I think we are at time now, so we do need to leave it there, but want to thank you again so much for all your work that you've been doing on this issue for decades now, and for sharing all your research and insights so generously with us today. And
No worries.
hopefully that can all help contribute to raising more awareness about, I think, an issue that needs much more attention than it's had. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Professor Lasslett.
Well, my pleasure. May I just finish by saying one thing I forgot to say is that, well, I did mention the documentary Ophir, but also there's a website called Colonial Syndrome, .org. So it's colonial syndrome, one word, .org. And that's working with the filmmakers to create a kind of education project where we could share a lot of the stories and perspectives that I've left out today of all the local people and their feelings about the conflict, the mine, where to next. It's all there on Colonial Syndrome. Beautiful vignettes of people's stories, and I love it if people we were using their teaching, because there's such beautiful, there's so many beautiful stories there and profound speakers, and it was our little attempt to try and make that available. So yep, perfect. Thank you for putting that in the chat. Please do share that around. It's there for teaching, and it'll be great to see it used.